Ladies, gentlemen, and Shimu of all ages, welcome to Towers of Aghasba, and I probably didn't pronounce that right, and there are plenty of other things I'm unlikely to pronounce correctly in this video or in relation to this game. But this is a brand new open-world indie survival RPG style experience. The game is honestly pretty as hell, especially once you actually get the nature building. And while it released into early access just yesterday, and clearly still has a long ways to go, I wanted to show this to you all in the hopes of putting it on your radar, and with the dream that the extra attention will help the developers make an even better game before it comes fully into being on its full launch through the process of this early access period. If you're someone who is willing to overlook and deal with the growing pains that come along with a proper early access game, you may even be interested enough to give this a go before we get to that point. So today I want to talk about my thoughts and opinions on Towers of Aghasba and why you may want to play it or at least keep it on your radar for the time being. And then at the end I'll just go over a few quick tips from my time playing the game so far for anyone starting completely fresh after watching this. First up, it's just the deep connection with nature that I adore so much for the game. The game honestly is just gorgeous visually speaking, and you'll find very early as part of the story that your job is to respread this sort of vibrant, expressive vegetation to the islands of this world. And while there are classic survival-like aspects like hunting the animals that are around the place, this is counterbalanced by the Amity system, which essentially rewards you for achieving balance within the ecosystem. Kill the animals that you must for the meat that you need from them, but balance it out by planting new trees or vegetation or feeding animals to gain their trust and propagate their existence, and also to get their dung, especially to get their dung. The creature designs are fantastical but fun. There's early stuff like the beetle pup, which sound like they are screaming at the top of their lungs like they're being murdered while just going about their normal life running around places for no reason. There's a little mole rabbit like hybrid guys that sort of skitter around, but as you level up your big main tree, you start to get more and greater animals around too. Things that are not only larger than the initial offerings, but just far more intriguing combinations too, like a chameleon and kangaroo hybrid, which is just as wild as it sounds, or plenty of other interesting combinations of animals into the creatures of this world. As far as the actual moment-to-moment gameplay then, there's a pretty wild and interesting building system going on. It doesn't seem to be made with the idea of like in-depth singular structure creation. You don't really make one section or one block at a time and then build it up. The only things that you can build in blocks are like little areas that you can farm on, and even those are massive blocks, so you more get to make like full-on structures with a utility purpose than anything aesthetic, like placing an entire farming village down in one go, or making a farm itself within the radius of this village, which is just a massive addition to your area in a single placement. Sure, there are smaller bits that you can create and manage for aesthetics if nothing else, but a lot of the building side of this game seems to be much more in a functional way than aesthetic and playful, which isn't necessarily a problem or a negative, and it definitely does appeal to a different group of people than the more standard survival block-by-block creation methods. Outside of this, there is of course the actual gameplay too. There's what has become pretty standardized climbing functions where you can climb pretty much anything that you can see in the game, and the amount that you can climb simply depends on your stamina bar. You can swim with the exact same restraints as well, and there is also a glider function, of course, as an open world game, to carry you further distances from higher up starting locations. The combat is extremely simple, at least to the point that I've reached myself relatively early in the game. There's an attack button, there's a dodge button, you can kite enemies through movement, and honestly, that's fine because the combat is far from the main part of this experience really. It's more just a smaller part of it. The main part is the exploration. It's finding new things, creating new life through your own choices of where to put what seeds, and completely customize your island and make it different than anyone else's island in that way as well. Not to mention that when you're actually hunting, there's things like bows as well that you can use to hunt fish underwater, and I don't want to explain the logistics of that because I don't understand how it works, but it's fun. As well, while it is a survival type game and you can't get meat or berries or other foods or stuff like that, there is no hunger or thirst meter for the player. There's no requirement to sleep or you'll die. None of those things that are sort of like busy work to keep you going in a lot of other survival games, and personally that is by far my preference, with the use for food items in this game being mostly for actually feeding the different animals and gaining their trust and resources, and again, their dung, without having to actually kill them. Not that you would get their dung from killing them, though logically I guess you should based on real life standards, and all of this just sort of feeds into the balance of the world. To be more clear about the balance that I keep mentioning, it's not just like a lore thing or a fun thing. There's a system called Amity within this game where you gain this resource by doing things like feeding the animals or planting seeds and growing new trees and plants of various kinds, but then the Amity system and your Amity count goes down every time that you kill a normally friendly animal, or if you chop down a tree for resources as an example. And Amity is a resource in itself itself that you can spend on upgrades along the way to upgrade your plant life as well, so you have to balance what you need with what the world needs in itself to actually grow and continue expanding. All that said, I don't want to exclusively focus on the positives for the game. Of course, I'm not trying to sell you a product here. I'm just sharing a fun game that I've been playing a bit since launch. And there are three sort of major sticking points here that I should mention. The first is it's buggy. It's a super early access game right after the beginning of the launch of early access is the largest sort of playtest that this game has ever been able to have. It's an indie game with a relatively small studio behind it, and so there are day one issues. A few of the bigger ones were actually already patched out very quickly too, as there were things like some gathering nodes would just apply damage to the player when you interact with them, and if you die, you respawn with just a super small amount of health that made you die in like one hit to the withered enemies, which are the hostile animal faction, which essentially just a ton of like spider-like creatures with nests around the world that you can cleanse and things like that. And this was fixed, so now you respawn with half your health bar and you no longer take damage from gathering, which is a really good combination of fixes. On top of this, there are currently login issues though, and multiplayer problems for the game. The game is supposed to support up to 4 players in a single world, hosted by one of these to bring others onto their unique island setup. But at least for the first day, logging in has been pretty much just impossible to do, possibly due to the unexpected amount of day one people playing the game. And along with that, it's worth noting that even if you purchase the game through Steam, the actual online system that the game runs through requires you to have and sign into an Epic Games account, theoretically because it has crossplay with other systems, at least eventually, which I know some people are just vehemently against having an Epic Games account just on principle, so it's worth mentioning that is a thing for the sake of it, though the single player version of the game does not require you to log in with anything or any of that stuff once you own the game. The third major thing is that some people have had some pretty major crashing issues with this game too. I haven't run into any of this myself as someone who often does have performance issues with a game, if it's at all possible to happen. Despite my rig being very powerful, it just seems to have some awkward incompatibilities with a lot of modern games that I usually have to spend time troubleshooting, and this game was actually fine for me. But again, before you spend money on it, the proper warning that at least at launch there are a few reports on the game's forums of people just having crash after crash after crash when playing the game. But at the very least, with the game being on Steam, if you do decide to try it and have this problem, refunds are always a pretty accessible option. Then before we end, I just want to give a few tips from my time with the game so far. First, the world is your oyster, not literally like an oyster, but more so that you have a lot of freedom. While the base layout of the map is the same for all players, the places you actually put stuff, like your colossal king tree that decides the entire biomes and region borders, are pretty much entirely in your control. You can put the tree down right where you first get the seed if you want to, or you can walk halfway across the starting island and put it down on the other edge if you prefer. It is entirely up to you, and the only truly limiting factor is the amount of space, because you need a big space for a big tree. On a similar note, early on after creating your first king tree, you'll be asked to place temperate seeds, and this can be a bit confusing if you try to spread them out and make your area look nice, maybe get them across your island a bit, but the reality is the game just wants you to put these seeds down right next to your main tree itself. And if it's more than a few feet away and on a radius from this tree, you'll be unable to plant them and probably be more than a bit confused. It took me quite a while to find out where I could put these originally, and that is at least, of course, until you get the giant seeds later on from the upgraded tree, which extends the ecosystem radius out a bit, which lets you plant seeds even further out. As for combat, especially early on, you just don't want to rush into killing things. Firstly, because as you learn, and as I've already talked about, the game is a lot about the balance between fostering nature and, of course, building it up and then tearing it down when you murder the sweet little animal creations, but also mainly because you just don't have the proper means to hunt at the start. The game doesn't tell you early, but control is the key to do a dodge roll on keyboard, which is genuinely very useful for avoiding attacks that you otherwise would very much struggle with, and when you are taught this is the introduction to the main hunting quest. So I recommend going for at least this quest before you start to get too explory, especially as this also gives you a spear, a bow, and access to a sword as well, which really expands your actual ability to fight the other creatures, especially the hostile ones. Past that, make sure that you always pick up the material rewards when you are feeding an animal, make sure you always observe new creatures with your telescope when you see them, and if you can get all of that down and sort of just put that in the back of your head, you'll manage just fine in this fantastical world. That just about does it for today, then everyone. Just a bit of an introduction and some tips for Towers of Aghasba, the newest creature hunting survival type RPG game that I've seen, which feels very mechanically Palworld-esque without the Pokemon influence, of course, which does feel like an odd thing to say, as that was the main sort of thing with Palworld as far as most people were concerned, but I think it's about the most accurate comparison that I can give to it so far. I hope you all enjoyed this then and either found something that you want to keep an eye on its progress in the future, or even maybe give a chance to right now. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.